Hey class, so with this video, I'm going to give a kind of a study guide to week one. I don't know if these study guides help or hurt, but anyway, here goes. The way I teach history is I try to teach it like a story. I try to tell you all a story. That's the way I think it makes most sense. It's easier to learn if it's a story. It's always easier to learn something if it's enjoyable. So when you listen to my podcast, when you look at the material, think about the bigger story that I'm trying to tell. And this week, really, the introduction is the indigenous peoples in the area of North America that we now call Texas. And I'm having you focus on two native groups, the Caddo and the Karankawa. Also, in my podcast, I talk about the bigger story of indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere. So I start out kind of broad, talking in the lecture about native groups in the hemisphere. And then I focus very, very tightly on two native groups that were here when Cabeza de Vaca washed ashore in the 1520s. Now, so that's the big story. Okay, so it's the story number one of the indigenous groups in the Western Hemisphere, with a focus very tightly on what today we call Texas, on the Caddo and the Karankawa. Now, I just want to stress to you that there are multiple native groups in Texas in the 1520s, dozens, if not more. But you know what? I just don't want to drive you crazy with too much detail. I want to highlight the two native groups that I think are most important for the Cabeza de Vaca aspect of the story, especially the Karankawa. So, number one tip, think about the big story that I'm telling. And if you think about the big story that I'm telling, then the facts, I think, are a little stickier. They make more sense. There's a context, in other words, for the facts that I'm discussing. And when I'm talking about facts, I'm talking about the things that students often dislike about history, classically, dates. You know, what's more soul-sucking than a date? I guess the close competition to that would be names. But so I try to, in a sense, de-emphasize the things that students hate about history, dates and names particularly. But on the other hand, there are some dates you have to know, and there are some names you have to know. In a sense, those are the spine of the story that I'm telling. Think about a show that you watch on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime, or I don't know where you watch your show, ABC, NBC, maybe some of you watch PBS, who knows? If you think about like a show that you watch, or a movie series that you watch, like the Marvel comics is a great example, or DC. You know, I read I read movie reviews of these comic Marvel and DC, and it's like, I don't know what the hell people are talking about. It's so convoluted. There's all these characters, and then they get together like the Avengers, and so you've got Iron Man, and then you've got Ant-Man, and then God knows who, Wonder Woman, or maybe anyway. So, but so for me, it doesn't really register. But if you're a Marvel Comics person or a DC Comics person, you know all those characters. You know how they fit in the wider Marvel comic universe or the DC comic universe. It's sticky. The dates and the names, or in particular the names in the order of the sequence of events, just make sense to you because you know the story. And so the details of the story and the characters in the story, they just make sense to you. There's a context for those specific facts. Well, certainly my Texas history course is not as exciting as Marvel Comics or DC Comics, by the way. I really dislike Star Wars. Yeah, I don't like any of those things, by the way. But maybe that just shows my age. Although I did see Andor on the Disney Channel earlier this year. Incredible. Boy, great show. If you have Disney Channel, check out Andor. Incredible show. Anyway, so that's the way to approach the course. What's the big story? What's the overall story? And then what are some of the specifics? And I try really hard to signal to you the specifics that you need to know in order to do well in this course. You have to know some dates. You can't think that Cabeza de Vaca washed ashore in what's Galveston in 1982, right? You just can't. You have to know when he got here. He got here about 40 years after, maybe a little bit less, after Columbus discovered the New World. By the way, I can't stress to you enough how important it is to take a look at the Cabeza de Vaca map. It'll just that one visual will make his whole story just so much more clear to you. You just take a minute and look at that map. Okay, so that's the first big thing I want to talk about. The way I teach this course, I try to tell a story each week. I try to tell a big story, and within that story, I fill in some details. But if you think about the bigger story first, the details, what often drives students crazy about history, they make sense. They're what I call they become sticky. There's a context for them. So that's how you should approach week one. And that's how you should approach the entire course. Okay, I'm going to stop and then I'm going to start another quick podcast.